Tonight we bring you news from Dorchester, continuing a long partnership with the Dorchester Reporter. Its publisher and managing editor, Bill Forey, has passed the torch on to one of his colleagues. We'd like to welcome the Reporter's news editor, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jennifer.
Of course. Thanks, Chris.
Well, as usual with the Reporter, political news is in the forefront, and you have two very interesting figures, one sort of trying to move up, another one sort of moving out. Talk about the one moving up, Ayanna Pressley.
So Ayanna Pressley is a familiar face in Boston, obviously. She's been on the city council since 2009 and until last year has been the most reliable ticket topper for the at-large race. So she's already a pretty common face. And the rumor has been that she's been mulling a congressional run for a few years now, and finally that happened last month when she threw her hat in the ring officially to challenge Michael Capuano, the long-serving rep for the 7th Congressional District. And it's an interesting race because you have a long-time representative in Capuano. He has a pretty good record as far as most voters are concerned. But Ayanna is making the case now that the seat itself calls for new blood, a new voice, and that the wait your turn mentality that we often see with these kinds of races, and especially with a fairly respected senior colleague, that doesn't quite jive with the changes that you've seen in the district demographically. So it's interesting that she's decided to take on this race right now, especially in the midst of another kind of interesting turnover in the 1st Suffolk seat, which is right next to it. So State Senator Linda Dorsina-Forey announced that she was going to be stepping down, and just the next week, Ayanna Pressley announced that she was going to be seeking higher office.
Yeah, talk about what's become this district. Back in the old days when it was the 8th, it was Joe Kennedy, and, Tip O'Neill, and it's the 7th now. And talk about the demographics and how they match up against these, the incumbent and Ayanna.
So the 7th is interesting because it's actually Massachusetts' only minority or majority minority district. So it's very, very heavily people of color. But interestingly, a Mass Inc. poll last week found that even though you've got a higher proportion of residents who are people of color, you've got a higher number of registered voters and regular voters who are actually white. So even though Ayanna counts among her support a pretty decent chunk of Boston, again, being a top vote getter, being a pretty familiar face, and doing very well in communities of color in Boston, she might have a bit of an issue in the suburbs where, again, it gets a little bit whiter, but also that she has less name recognition out there. She's not as much of a known presence. So Capuano, again, will have more of an advantage there, even though historically he's done very well in districts of color, especially in Dorchester.
Well, thanks to the St. Patrick's Day breakfast here, I say Linda Dorsina-Forey maybe had even more recognition, and surprisingly, this rising star is stepping out of electoral politics.
She is, and that caught a lot of people by surprise. So it's not an unusual step for people who go into public office to then later decide to make a segue into private partnership, depending on financial situations, where they are with their family, and where they are in the career. But this one was interesting. It was right at the end of January, and she announced that she would be stepping down pretty much the next day, and that closed out her term as senator. And as you mentioned, she was considered ascendant. She came in from being an aide for Charlotte Golar-Ritchie back in the day, and then worked in the city for a while, then was elected representative 13 years ago.
She gave this farewell speech at the State House, and I think a lot of people were wondering, is this riding off into the sunset, or is she leaving the door open to maybe coming back in politics?
Yeah, so she did touch on that slightly in her speech today. Yesterday, she gave a farewell speech before the House and the legislature, and Governor Baker, as well as former Governor Deval Patrick, who's always counted her as an esteemed colleague. And I think because of the conditions of her departure, where she left for personal reasons to pursue a specific opportunity, it does leave open the possibility that if she wanted to come back into public service, she might consider doing that. She still has a strong base of support there. But right now, I think she's kind of clearing the slate. I don't expect that she'll completely recede from public life. That doesn't really seem her style. And she will be working in a prominent post at Suffolk Construction, which is also a player in the development world around Boston.
Well, she had the unusual connections to different communities in her district, plus the unique political talent. But what about the people running to take her place now? How does that look so far, at least?
So we've got 2 state reps that have thrown their names in so far. The deadline to finally pull papers and submit the needed 300 signatures to enter the race isn't until the 20th. So we've still got a few more days if anyone wants to really make a bold move there. But who are looking like the front runners are State Rep Nick Collins, who did run for the seat in 2013.
And he's from South Boston.
From South Boston, and former Senator Forey at that time, State Rep, did actually beat him by just a few hundred votes in a fairly close race in South Boston. But again, let's remember that the seat itself was redistricted quite some time ago now to expand all the way down into Dorchester, into Mattapan, and a little bit further beyond that. So that left an opportunity, again in this race, for Evandro Carvalho, whose district, the 5th Suffolk, does overlap slightly with that district, who's decided to make a move for that as well. So Nick Collins is considered to be the favorite given his experience in the district and his former attempt at it and his considerable finances. But Evandro Carvalho, also state rep, who came into the House in 2014, is the other leading figure. 3 other folks have pulled papers, though it's again not certain what the final bunch looks like. So that's going to be BPS parent Kenny Jervis, a local pastor Don Osgood Jr., Senior, and Althea Garrison, who's the former state rep and a well-known entity in Boston politics.
This has been on news, and we're talking with Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Jennifer, the school budget plan is out. City is spending more of its own money. A lot of schools are getting more. I say maybe the majority are getting more of that, but there are some schools getting less, and I guess there's some concern. Dot Academy, talk about why people are concerned about that school.
Right, so Dorchester Academy has been struggling. It's a turnaround school, it's an alternative high school, and it's been facing quite some problems over the past few years or so. There have been layoffs, there's been talk of parents being encouraged to take their kids out of that school, and the way that the school budgeting, the BPS budget works, is something called a weighted student formula, where generally speaking, in the broadest terms, the money follows the students. So if there are more students enrolling in a particular school, there's going to be more funding allocated to that school, and if they are to leave and go somewhere else, again, the funding follows them. And in situations like Dot Academy, where you're facing more than $1 million in a potential cut, so it's actually the highest percentage potential cut across the school district, there is some question about whether the way that they calculate out the student funding is creating a vicious cycle for these schools that are already underperforming to then lose that additional funding, making them possibly less desirable, and then kind of continuing that. And you see something similar with Brighton High School that again sees those kinds of cuts and has been another subject of pretty extended concern.
I know your paper's been covering some very large and transformative development plans, but one thing you also covered, controversy about Popeye's chicken in Cobham Square. What's going on there?
Yes, this is one of those situations that seems a little bit odd on its face. We're all pretty familiar with the glut of fast food restaurants all around the city. Codman Square also has a lot of them. And the Codman Square Neighborhood Council expressed some concern back in 2016 when a Popeyes came to them for a proposal on Washington Street to open up a restaurant, and the neighborhood council, some of the local health centers, and the elected officials were concerned. They've made an attempt, a concerted effort to try and bring more healthy food into the area. They run farmers markets. They're trying to encourage healthier lifestyles. So they didn't feel like that was something they really wanted to get behind in that location. And they presented a united front when it went before the Zoning Board of Appeals, and it was denied with prejudice at the time. And the Popeyes applicant did appeal the decision to Superior Court, even though that's kind of off to the back burner right now. because what they ended up doing was changing their permit. So instead of saying they were going to be opening up a brand new takeout restaurant, they changed it so that it would be the expansion of an existing one. The premise there being that they could not have more than 75% of their profits be takeout. So it's an interesting technicality, but because of that technicality, they can build as of right. And this was a bit of a surprise to the folks in the neighborhood when they walked by this building that they thought was kind of in standstill for the moment, and found that there was construction happening. So there's been a renewed push to just have better clarity from the city about where this kind of process goes wrong, and if community members should be notified, especially as City Councilor Andrea Campbell noted, if there was a project that was denied for very specific reasons, if it's then approved later, even in a slightly different form, should people be told about it, especially given that they still object to it for all of the reasons that they did initially.
I know there's more to cover here, developments in Mattapan, the Globe, and Columbia Point Peninsula, but you've got a website and you've got a Twitter feed, so tell us where people should find it.
Yeah, you can find all of the local news happening in Dorchester at .news.com, and also you can either follow the paper itself on Twitter at .news is our handle, or me at jen.smith.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Chris.
Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Up ahead, new steps to look for warning signs of violence in the Boston Public Schools, but first, this message.